here with Eric Meier, a former guest on the podcast, although a long time ago under the name of Greta, and we were talking about something completely different than what we're talking about today. I think originally we were talking about theories of war, and now we're talking about democratic economic planning and art. And Eric has recently had an exhibition of the aesthetics around democratic economic planning, and you have co-founded an international network called the International Network for Democratic and Economic Planning, in depth, which sounds cool because I like when the
Thank you.
acronyms are pronounceable. Um,
Marketing.
yeah, indeed. Um, so we're going to talk today a little bit about the aesthetics around uh, art design and economic planning, which is not a commonly discussed uh, thing. I mean, one of the things that I think your exhibition is aimed at getting at, and then I'm going to let you contextualize it a little bit in a second, but is to get away from this idea that everything is like Soviet Gosplan and it's all socialist realism, or it's not, or it's nothing. There's no aesthetics at all. Just pure technocratic brutality. And you want to move, I think you want to move the needle there. So tell us a little bit about your exhibition.
Yes. First of all, super thanks for having me on after such a long time. I'll actually try my best to make the connection between like strategy, war, and stuff to later on in the podcast. That kind of stuff is like still in the back of my head and like has has relevance to what I'm doing now, but as a teaser for later. And yeah, so to give a little bit of context for the exhibition, so I've been engaged in this like space around like new models of democratic economic planning. Like your listeners have probably heard about the People's Republic of Walmart book, like which is like the most famous one I think that has popularized that discussion. And then you have like the classic models like with from people like participatory economics with Robin Hanel, like the cyber communism of like Paul Cockshott, etc. And there was like a third one, which was the third one. Whatever. There are like classic stuff, and in recent years, this discussion has become like really, really, really lively, and which is super, super cool. And I've been following it for like around, let's say, 5 years now on the sidelines. Like, I'm not like a super specialist who's like, okay, I understand every model, every aspect of it in depth totally, but I have like a good overview knowledge and I'm very interested in like, okay, see how this space develops, like not only theoretically, but also what are the connections to like real world developments, parties, etc., etc. And yeah. So last year in the summer, there was like I'm based in Germany. There was like a kind of like a huge publishing wave in big German newspapers, which aren't leftist. Like they're like sometimes leaning quite conservatively. And it was about, let's say, like 5 to 6 articles that were all talking about like democratic economic planning. And all of them, like, let's say, first of all, they were talking about the idea of that, like, not super specific aspects of it, but the general idea. And all of them were at least, let's say, neutral or balanced. And none of them was like, okay, they're like just bashing the whole thing of like, oh my god, this is like in Germany the GDR is like the first reference point that comes up. Uh, so on what the article said, like that was also the time when the Evgeny Morozov podcast, the Santiago Boys, came out. So there was good overlap with that. But uh, in essence, the articles were quite like surprisingly positive, let's say. But all of the images, like like when articles have like their header pictures, that you also see as preview pictures on social media when you post a link, um, they were all either super abstract and you didn't know what to do with that, or it was actual pictures that were associated with like the GDR, like lines of like the Trabis, the one model of automobile that was produced in the GDR. And so even though the articles were like, okay, this is kind of like a huge step that I didn't expect, was like, okay, who reads a full article? Someone who's super interested by it, and 95% of people only see the picture and read the title, and that's how the image of what is being talked about and the tone, etc., is being formed. Like that's what sticks. And so I was like, okay, it's kind of fucked up that we have like these, yeah, these really bad aesthetics associated with these articles. And then I was thinking, okay, but what would be like an alternative? And it was super hard to come up with one because let's say like the overall aesthetics that are associated that we find in this discourse are, yeah, not great. let's say it like that. And then we come to the, okay, also like you have like a little bit of not really a revival of socialist realism, but it's like sometimes you have this aesthetic of, okay, here like roughly Soviet aesthetics, but make it with computers. Like, oh, that
Vaporwave, socialist realism, or something like.
yeah, it goes in that direction sometimes. Like, and um, also has like this like weird nostalgic bent to it. And then you have like the, which is kind of similar, even though it's like a little bit more modern. The oh, where the Walmart book reference comes in, like, let's do Amazon or Walmart, but make it socialist. Like, oh, big computer will plan the economy. I don't know, maybe you or some of your listeners have heard about like the big computer mafia meme. Like
Yeah.
a few years ago on Twitter there was like, yeah, it was like a group chat on Twitter or something. And
Yeah.
yeah. But it's like
My old
basically
colleague Douglas Lane wrote a whole book about the big computer.
oh my
Go ahead. It's called Batch Batch Revolution. Uh, he thought it was a utopia. All the reviewers thought it was a dystopia. But anyway, back to the thing.
yeah. Yeah, I'm kind of like only recanting or like taking stock of like, okay, what are the aesthetics in this space? And then the other
Mhm.
one is like Cybersyn,
Yeah.
which is the most interesting one because it's also the newest to most people, because Cybersyn is like in the wider public still quite unknown, but it has the same problems. It's like also nostalgia. It's kind of like it has the same kind of melancholia of, oh, 50 years ago there was this historical possibility, and if things would have turned out differently, then we would have a completely different world by now probably. But this window of opportunity is gone, and everything we can do is kind of like remember it, mourn it, kind of like, but there is nothing genuinely new pointing to the future, anything that's like really exciting and relatable. And so those are kind of like the three big established, let's say, aesthetics that people kind of, I feel like it's just like the repertoire that people kind of like fell back onto because that's what's circulating in their circuits already. And I was like, okay, this is like a big strategic political problem. We need to think more about our relation to aesthetics and how, yeah, and that's how stuff started.
Okay. So, what was the initial response to your exhibit?
Oh, um, yeah. Also, like super quickly for the listeners, there will be a link in the show notes where
There
you
will
can
be.
watch the exhibition, and it's kind of like three parts. The exhibition, like one part was kind of like the taking stock of and the one aesthetic that I forgot was basically one that is like abstract diagrams of like, for example, these like planning models. And then I had a middle part which was kind of like, okay, uh I either took already existing artwork from people that I thought was cool and thought, hey, you can make text commentary how that relates to democratic economic planning, or I actually like commissioned some people to do something in their style and say, okay, hey, mobilize your own associations. Don't go deeply into the theory. And the last part was like just my own experimental stuff. And I think the first part, because that was already established, was something that people could like make the most sense out of. The middle part was like very exciting, I think, for a lot of people because it was really like, um, let's say it's a lot of contemporary internet aesthetics, and like also goes into like plays around with the revival of Y2K aesthetics and a revival of like a consciousness for the Frutiger Arrow design paradigm, which was kind of like the tech design paradigm from like very early 2000s to like late 2000s, early 2010s. And to be honest, I don't really know what people made of my own stuff. Like, I think that was the most disorientating. Um, but there were like one or two, like, at least what was cool, people were like, hey, I can connect to this thing, to this one piece. And there was never really where people were like completely dumbstruck and didn't know what to do with it at all. And I feel like the more I talk about it, the more I write about it, the more I also get like a confidence to also say, hey, this is not just weird shit that I'm doing, but this is like genuinely important and interesting. And yeah, uh, there was an interesting thing. So we have like a reading group here in Bonn, Germany, about democratic economic planning. And on the
Mhm.
local May festival, we had like a little, the most nerdy lefty thing you can probably do, like having a little stand where you promote your reading group.
Mhm.
Like, yeah, that kind of thing. And the guy who organized the reading group said, hey, why don't we put like some of your art stuff like on like a little wall so it gets eyeballs? And that was a really good conversation opener because like it's like so stylistically like eclectic and not your classic leftist socialist aesthetics at all. But I
Mhm.
think that was what drew people in. It wasn't like, oh, this is like the new branding kind of thing, but like it was completely, this was different, this was different, this was different. But that was its strength. I always thought like this eclecticism was its weakness, because we think like, oh, aesthetics must be like a consistent thing that's like one concept, like kind of like an avant-garde kind of thing, or there's like one idea behind all of it, and then you kind of like that idea then gets like aesthetically manifested, and turned out that was a strength. So that was an interesting feedback, and yeah.
So I guess the question is for a lot of people would be, why is thinking about the aesthetics of democratic economic planning, or socialism important beyond the obvious? I mean, the obvious is like, yes, you got to get someone to read an article. You need a picture, and they need to click, and it's got to hit them immediately. But what are the other ramifications of aesthetics around?
Yeah, so basically beyond like the pure marketing aspect of
Right.
propaganda. Like, yeah, okay. The purely you use, yeah. Um yeah. I think there's a lot. Um I'm trying like I I'm gonna try to give like the most pre-formulated answer. It's kind of like something like a um yeah, like something like a ready-made answer I have in my mind. It's basically okay. Um, when you have a discussion, like for example the stuff around democratic economic planning, which is like very abstract, very theory heavy, very concept heavy, which makes it intrinsically inaccessible to people who don't have the background, etc., etc. So then if you then say, okay, hey, you get into a certain kind of political situation where that can actually gain traction, uh, this situation makes it very likely that this will be branded like politically branded as like, oh, this is just another elite discourse, and all of the possible bad associations will be put onto that. If it's not like, if it's just, oh, then it's like, oh, the elites are going to try to plan our economy, and then like all of the totalitarianism associations will like pop up again, and yeah, and so it's like the core of democratic economic planning must be, okay, people need to be involved in one way or another. That doesn't mean, okay, hey, you have it like everyone is involved with everything. That's not possible. But like involved to a certain degree, and having kind of like an aesthetics where it's like, okay, think about it as like an architecture render, where it's like, okay, maybe have like a text or like an abstract diagram of, oh, this is how the planning process would work, and this is what, for example, like uh your factory, your office, etc., how that would work in this process. And that's very abstract. And when you have something like an architecture render, something like a visualization, then it's more concrete of okay, this is what that would mean for your everyday life. This is how would it be like to like, this is to work in such an environment, to be, okay, what does it mean how your work environment is like embedded into this like larger planning process. And so it gives it more of a, like, it's more imaginable in people's minds. And so the image kind of like works. It is now just one type of image. You might say, like what I said, like the parallel is like an architecture render. So it's like very naturalistic. It's like just a literal depiction, or like that's as adequate as possible, an approximation of depicting how that would look like. You might also say like a simulation, like whatever word you might want to use for it. And that can give people kind of like a vibe check, so to say, of like, okay, do I like what's presented to me here or not? Which, if you only have this like super abstract discourse that you don't understand at all, you you aren't able to have a vibe check on it. Like, do I like this or not? And so the visual dimension in this regard opens up the discourse for people to have a word about, do I want this or not? And maybe also to like navigate, okay, what do I like about this? What do I not like about this? And I think that's what and that hopefully this can then like be integrated into the whole like, yeah, model discussion. Yeah, that's, for now, I think that's my first answer to this. Maybe I can iterate on it and find other aspects on this. Yeah.
Well, I mean, I guess one of the emphasis on economic planning that you're putting in here as a kind of socialist planning is that it needs to be democratic. Like that's in
Yep.
the title. So aesthetics both has to be appealing but also communicative, right? So it's got to do both, and that's kind of a challenge. So
Yep.
do you think that do you think that this approach, kind of broadens it out from like the Lee Phillips, and I forgot who else wrote that Republican Robot book,
I have it.
or
Michael Rozovsky. I
Mike
have
Rozovsky,
it
yeah,
right here.
and are the kind of Paul Cockshot, which is a very Soviet, slightly cybernetic model. I guess there's also Paracon, which, okay, but it is a form of democratic economic planning. For those of you who don't know, that's participatory economics. So you mentioned that there was discussions on this, though, even in conservative outlets, or relatively conservative outlets, like mainstream outlets. What do you think is getting people interested in economic planning right now?
That's a good question. I think, like, in terms of observing kind of like, okay, I think there are a few things. I think one of the key experience in recent times was just the COVID pandemic, and seeing that like that the state has the capacity to like intervene and
Mm.
intervene quickly, urgently, and on a large scale. Like doesn't mean that okay, all of the COVID, all of like everything that the state did with regards to COVID was good, or that it was even in the interest of like people and not in the interest of like capital. Like sometimes, sometimes protecting the health of people is also good for capital, and sometimes if you're like an essential worker, a frontline worker, like fuck your health, you still gotta do your stuff, like because
Mm.
and yeah, it basically it showed to people, okay, hey, there's this capacity that I think people didn't have any recent memory. Like maybe you might say, okay, hey, the financial crisis of like 2008, etc. But that was like it was very divorced from your own life. It was like okay, intervention into like financial markets, but that's kind of it. And yeah, it's not as direct as with COVID. I think then it's like the uh, climate change, uh, ecological crisis, where it's like okay, things don't seem to be so good. The market doesn't really seem to be doesn't seem to be delivering on that, and people are like asking more and more. Okay, like yeah, what else is there? I think that is also related to like this revival of industrial strategy kind of thing. Like, yeah, lots of discussion like industrial strategy, like the IRA, the Chips and Sciences Act in the US with Biden, etc., etc. All like that doesn't amount to economic planning yet, but it there is this revival of okay, we don't just let the market do its thing, but there's like actual kind of like steering of the economy by the state at least as a goal, and actual like that has realpolitik relevance right there, and so that's a big thing. And I think also, let's say at least like in the more technical, nerdy circles, the technology part is like a really big one. With the okay, hey, with the state of computers, computing, maybe AI. I don't know enough about AI and to really say okay, this is true or not. But yeah, questions like, okay, hey, can't we have something else than the price mechanism that might kind of like embody trade-off relations between different goods better than money and the price? And I think it's a bunch of stuff that like comes together, and yeah,
Mm.
I would. I think that's kind of about it, and it's really interesting to see also the development of that. Like a few years ago, this was like a super niche topic, like super niche. Like I don't know. I was at the General Intellect Unit podcast, for example, also talking about the exhibition. They, I think, have been. They started in like 2018 or something, and I think all of this, or like a good chunk of this, was also there was an overlap between like the end of what you would say, what you would call like the left accelerationist discourse, the what is it, the Inventing the Future by Nick Chernak and Alex Williams,
Yeah.
and yeah, and kind of like that kind of like fizzled out, but they
Very
gesture.
quickly too. Actually, it kind of like rose very fast. It went away very fast. Like it was
Yeah, yeah.
kind of fascinating.
Yeah, and there, I think a lot of people like in the podcast sphere, for example, kind of like took up that the fragments of that discourse and said, okay, hey, let's concentrate on this like technology and economic planning part, and go a little bit more in depth there, and yeah, and over the last few years, like also shout out to the Future Histories podcast by Jan Gross, who had like a big role in really building like a community. Like he had basically, you know, how Hideo Kojima makes like picks with like famous actors and musicians. Jan Gross basically is like, okay, hey, here's another podcast guest, here's another podcast guest, and he has really built like a community, especially of academics, let's be honest, um, around this podcast. And yeah, but this stuff has been incubated over the last few years, and people are coming. This had like a certain avant-garde function, I feel like, and now, yeah, it's spreading more and more. That's my
Yeah,
observation.
I it's interesting because we can't blame the spread of that on COVID exactly, because it was very when I first started. I mean, I'd heard about Cyberston since probably the early aughts, late '90s. I wasn't even a leftist yet when I first heard about it. It was kind of misrepresented, though. I mean, because it's actually like one Allende. Allende's big development was actually in socialist planning was actually the Codorna system, more than the computer stuff. Stanford Beer's computer stuff was promising, but they didn't fully roll it out ever. So like, some of the gains that were attributed to it were actually based on other social technologies, and it would have made those work more efficiently if they'd have thought about dealing with the military. I guess that's one way that it relates to our prior topic.
That's half of the message that like Evgeny Morozov pushes in his the Santiago Boys podcast. That like, okay, guys, think a little bit more seriously about the military and about like the threats. Like they are not afraid to make their hands dirty. Like that's a reality you have to deal with.
Kind of definitionally for military, like, yeah, it is something to think about. And the other thing I remember, was around 2010. People started really looking at not just Gosplan, and for my audience who doesn't know, Gosplan was what they actually did for Soviet planning, but there was also all these Soviet cybernetic developments that were kind of concurrent to what was being worked on by Norbert Wiener and people, and they weren't really picked up, mostly for military. And again, the military was part of the reason why the military was paranoid about the security threats. So, when the development of the Soviet personal computer was stalled because the military was paranoid about security threats. Like, but they actually had, they figured out a lot of this stuff and not implemented it. And in fact, some of it was studied by Norbert Wiener and the people around him, and that's part of what they brought over. And American planning and cybernetic system is kind of indebted to Soviet, but the Soviets didn't really use it that much. So, I guess the next question is, like, when I looked at some of what you aesthetically what came out of that project, some of it was interesting to me, like how different it was from like memes around capitalist stuff, and then other pieces looked almost identical to things I'd see around like vaporwave aesthetics. I mentioned that earlier. What do you think drives a lot of these aesthetic choices and presentation around this stuff? I mean, that's a huge question. I know.
Yes.
But...
Yeah. I mean, I can only speculate. I can talk about like, let's say, like the aesthetic influences. Maybe that's a question
that's where we go there.
Yeah, that's probably like a better question I can answer than like speculating how people choose their style. Like so yeah, as I said, like there's huge influences from like the revival of like Y2K aesthetics, and for everyone, like, to break it super down, like basically you have like, okay, yeah, what was it, like in the 80s, or maybe like early 90s, like there's like Memphis, like there's like really pastel colors with like geometric shapes, like the funky stuff. And Y2K aesthetics is like, okay, not only but also like lots and lots of chrome. Like if you think about electronics that has like translucent plastic around as the shell, where you could look inside, so you see the circuit boards and stuff, and yeah, and there's been like a real revival of Y2K aesthetics, um, especially in fashion in recent times, but also in, I would say, like digital art. And like in specific circles that I follow on Twitter, they have like all of what they're doing, and all of the variations is like different versions of like having like a spiky metal shape, or like a very smooth metal shape behind like a weird background, and all of that is like different variations of that. And yeah, and then there's like the next kind of like paradigm that came after Y2K is like the fruitiger arrow paradigm. And maybe some of you have like seen like like videos about fruitiger arrow have really popped off recently on YouTube. Like, and there's like kind of really this retrospective of like, hey, why does this thing look so familiar, but also so like far away time wise? And it's like really this like if you see especially aesthetics from like big tech companies like Google, Apple, etc. Like when you open Google search and you see like, yeah, they always have like some graphic on top or something, and the way they, for example, portray humans, it's like this super cartoonish, but also like very flat, very like only monochromatic colors for one shape, and but then also like distorted proportions, like you know what I'm talking about. And that's what's kind of like the contemporary design paradigm. You also find that in like UI stuff. Um, and oh my god, what was the name? Uh, oh god, I know now. I'm forgetting the name. Um, yeah, if you say like flat corporate design, there is like a specific kind of design name for that. But basically, yeah, that stuff. And then it's like, oh, but what was before that? That was Frutiger Arrow. Very lots of blue and green tones, lots of like the tone of like nature, but also like, oh, the web and like global civilization, and like a very kind of like, let's say, like naive, somewhat utopistic like promise of the future. It's like very in line with like the emergence of like social media, Silicon Valley, and all, and like this whole, oh, social media will bring about global democracy and everything will be fine. Like it's very in line with that kind of like ideological promise. And that's very interesting for people to like, they also have like, oh, this is what I mean, you're a good chunk older than me, so I guess this does not count for you. But like, people my age, like I'm 27, um, they look at these YouTube videos and it's like, oh, this is the stuff that I've seen like in my like childhood and a little bit later in childhood, and this is what I grew up with. And it's like lots of like also your emotional connection to this kind of stuff. Like this is kind of like the promise that you had when you grew up about the future. And then, bam, okay, mid 2010s flat corporate design.
Yeah,
And then that's
everything loses like all of its. I mean, now we have flat corporate design to the extent that the flat corporate design, which was designed to be easily read on an iPhone, has now changed physical design. Like,
okay.
one of the things that's happening here in the United States is fast food restaurants, ubiquitous here, right?
Yeah.
They're not as ubiquitous in Europe. The kind of logos that you would see on an app are now used as signs. So they're one color, matte.
Yeah. That's, yeah. Oh
Like,
god. Yeah.
so this aesthetic that started as an internet removal of that has now spread to the real world, and actually even affects like the way these buildings are built, so that they you walk in, you hit a screen, there's a bunch of uncomfortable looking chairs that look vaguely like a hipper version of like the 70s view of space. And like you know It's also like my interest as a old person.
I didn't say that.
No, it's okay.
I didn't mean it like that.
No, I do. No, for listeners, the big joke is I comment on my age all the time. But as a person who was born in the 80s, vaporwave aesthetics is interesting to me because it influences that period that you're talking about. But the other thing is it actually goes back to a time where we weren't really optimistic about the future, but there was still a vision. There was still like a vision for what it was represented aesthetically, both grimdark and not. And after around the mid aughts, you don't see a lot of that. So like even in the mid aughts, there's like I like to call it like the Appleification of everything. But you have that design period. And some of that's appealing. I mean, it's like it's somehow like if your iBook merged with IKEA, that's what
Oh
it
my
looks
god.
like.
Oh my god. Oh my god,
Like,
this is now giving me nightmares. But yeah.
But you know what I'm talking about.
I know,
You know,
I know. But it's like what you were saying, like this kind of like, let's say, this approach, like like the everything comes from everything comes from this like one big store, and it's kind of like branded by like all of like also I don't know, like I feel like you see this type of stuff like uh sneaking into every more parts of our lives, like but this is more of a vibe right now. I don't really have like specific examples, which isn't the best thing to say, but uh yeah. And I get what you mean. I get what you mean. Um, I also needed to think. I also needed to laugh a little bit with IKEA because there's like an artist. Like also, I'm quite new to art. Let's say I kind of like got into this earlier last year. Like that's not. And I also realized that okay, well, I guess I kind of always liked this stuff, but I never called it art or like never art proper, and I always felt very uncomfortable in museums and still kind of do. Uh, for me, art was always associated with just like, oh, that's something for old elitist people. Like, because where I grew up in a small, it, that was what it was basically. And but yeah, there was this also like at the same time I got into art earlier last year. I came across this musician James Ferraro,
mm-hmm.
and he's like super influential, and I love him. And he has like a bunch of albums, but like one album where it's like the a big part is like kind of like just certain like somewhat distorted ambient synth melodies in the background. And then you have
Mm-hmm.
like one of these like old AI text to speech generators. Like, and that's just busting out certain buzzwords, certain keywords. And one of them is IKEA refugee tent. Of these like, and the like you have these like weird synths, the started synths, and then this like text to like early 2010 spec text to speech generators, and it's kind of like uh summoning this like super dystopian like, oh, this is how humanitarian crises kind of like, yeah, I bet there is like something like an IKEA refugee tent, like, not that that's bad, but it's in terms of like the normalization, and like I think you get what I mean. Like
Mm-hmm.
yeah, like the customer streamlining everything. Like yeah. Uh yeah, just shout out to James Ferraro. I was lucky enough to actually meet him and see like a live concert by him in Cologne last year, where he played in a church,
Mm-hmm.
and like his recent stuff is with like synthetic monk chants, and that was like kind of a vibe in that environment too. And yeah, uh,
So I want to lean into. I mean, we've been talking about democratic economic planning maybe we'll shift to that for a while and get back to aesthetics. But let's talk about what it isn't. On the in-depth networks about page, you talk about why you reject early 20th century command economies. But can you go into a little bit about that, and then I think we might talk about the aesthetics of command economies, because I do think that's actually interesting. So, why do you guys reject command economic planning?
Yeah. First of all, I can say like I'm not the best one to make like any theoretical oh, this is why it's bad. Like I'm not the person to make the best take out of it, just as a prelude. But basically, I think one point is certainly like, okay, the lack of like actual democratic input when you have like a certain kind of like, okay, isolated party bureaucrats, basically, where like there's much like there are a lot of dimensions to it. Okay, like basically you don't really have like democratic input, where like, okay, this is what people want. That this type of stuff actually goes into the plan, actually starts playing like a huge role in what kind of decisions are made in terms of like investment, but also in terms of like stuff like consumer goods. When you have a structure where you have like a very isolated party bureaucratic elite, or like that they are entangled in like really bad incentive structures, like for example the factories, where it's like, okay, hey, it's like you have so many information problems. I'm sorry that I'm like jumping back and forth here a little bit, but you have like stuff like information problems, like how do you ensure that in a planning system, factories also deliver reliable data about like, okay, how many resources do they need, what are they producing, etc., etc. And if you have kind of like a punishing system of, oh, if you don't meet your target goals, then you get punished in one way or another. Of course, it makes sense for the factory to like intentionally set like the target goals really below than what they're probably gonna achieve. So like they overshoot it and like, oh hey, that's great, you did a really good job then. Uh, but then if you have that for every factory, like there's like such a distortion of information. Whereas like one of the big arguments of like the planned economies thing is like, okay, hey, something like the market and prices really distort information, because price is like first of all, price needs like is always recalculating and always like approaching, let's say like uh approaching representing trade-off structures like demand and supply, but it's never like, it's always in flux. And let's say like the social interaction of selling and buying are like these computational processes whereby like, okay, hey, what kind of price is actually should be on the market are like computed, and that takes a lot of time. That takes a huge amount of time. And so the point is like, okay, hey, if we could calculate these trade-off structures, maybe in money, maybe not, I'm agnostic about that. We could like have something like, we could have these trade-off structures and supply demand structures much better, much quicker, much more adequately represented. But that isn't possible when you have all of these fucked up information problems with all of the incentives, with all of the bad incentive structures. And that's kind of like a technical problem, but one that's also intertwined with like the political and organizational problem. And yeah, that's kind of like, I think that's one of the good points, where it's like, yeah, it's like not genuinely democratic, and also like not being actually democratic is also like, has also on the technical level really bad consequences for, does this thing actually work, and does it deliver what it promises on. Yeah, that's my answer for now, I think.
Yeah, and what do you think that kind of command economies does to the aesthetics or the appeal? Because I think one of the things you and I would say is aesthetics do matter. Like they're like they matter for a variety of reasons, but not just, I don't think it's, just what people think. And I even think the Soviet Union understood that, at least by the 60s and 70s. But at that point, they had all these other problems. So, um, like like what kind of aesthetic choices do command economies tend to make? I mean, everyone had like there's this weird nostalgia for brutalism, but I always like, yeah, that just comes from the fact you have to build a lot of buildings with concrete really fast. Like they're gonna look a certain way. Like
I might add, I know like especially in like, let's say like kind of internet influenced communist circles, there is this like huge, people love brutalism, and I think it's a little bit like, I know it's a counterforce against like, oh my god, commie blocks are so ugly, and look what socialism or communism does to our like beloved housing and stuff. Um, oh, aren't American suburbs the ideal way of living? like, I
mm,
understand that it's a counterforce against that, but I think it's also kind of like cope. Like, I don't, I, I don't like Soviet brutalism. Like, I like the monuments and I like the bus stations, but I think like brutalism or brutalist influence architecture in like especially like in the southern hemisphere, and is so much more interesting. Like African brutalism, like you have like South American brutalism. Uh, the buildings look a little bit different, but just as like an aesthetic choice. Like India has also like super interesting brutalism with like the Parliament by Le Corbusier and stuff. And like of course there are also histories of like Soviet influence, why these buildings look a certain way. Um, but yeah, have a little bit of like heat, a little bit of like plants around it, and things have like a completely different vibe to it, and like a completely different aesthetics appearance. Um, but yeah, oh my god, about the aesthetic choices of, um, yeah. To be honest, I've never really asked myself that question. They seem very downstream from like the practical requirements in terms of production. Like, okay, like you pump out mass goods, like mass produced goods that all look like very similar. And uh because it's kind of like rather easy in terms of like being able to plan for it versus like planning for a lot of variety. Um, and then you have the problems with like, okay, one of the downsides was like not having like that many and not that innovative consumer goods, yada yada. Um, but yeah, I don't. Yeah, to be honest, I don't really have an answer to that question because I've never really asked that myself. Like, what I find interesting maybe is I had like a couple of pieces on that in my exhibition. Uh, the question of what you might call interface design
mm-hmm,
and data visualization, like with Otto Neurath, who uh, Otto Neurath wanted basically like a picture language, like a symbolic language that could communicate economic plans to everyone. And we're talking like early 20th century here, so like lots of people also illiterate. And like we're talking completely different levels of education than nowadays. And um, he developed with like two other like I don't remember their names right now, but like with two other people, this like isotype language, which we
mm-hmm,
now maybe also call like pictograms, and these then were used to visually represent like certain production plans, for example, and that's I would say is like an early version of data visualization. And then where it's like, okay, hey, this enables people to, there we come a little bit back to what earlier with like, okay, what's the role in we might say what's the role in aesthetics in also planning itself. It makes people understand, like it's a certain kind of visual complexity reduction of, okay, it makes you understand something that you weren't able to understand before, and given on that understanding that you then have give a certain kind of feedback if the communication pipelines for that are there, and the isotype approach was also utilized by the people who did the Half of Socialism game, which is like a planning game, and yeah, they also like like Otto Neurath is kind of like having like a big revival at the moment. Yeah, so there's like that's not command economies, but like it's kind of like how are aesthetics intertwined. I would say like more on a design level here, like really of like okay, they're part of like a design, and less of like aesthetics as like something that's yeah. I don't know. Yeah, maybe I just think the word design fits a little better here. Yeah.
Okay. So what can we say about the seeming? We go back to some in-depth principles. You also talk about the rejection of market economies and why. And okay, that's obvious when we're talking about like capitalism, but you also reject market socialism. Could you go into why there?
Yeah, like also same upfront comment basically as before, but like the fundamental thing is like basically okay, hey, if you don't have like democratic macroeconomic coordination, so something else than the market, then even though on the internal level, like even though internally a corporation might be structured democratically, which is cool and which is a great step, it still has to deal with like these like um emergent constraints where it's like okay, hey, you have to like maximize profitability, you have to then you go into a certain kind of like self-exploitation because of these like outside constraints, and yeah, like that's basically simply because like the forces that how to say that that affect even like from the outside, even the internally democratically governed corporation, these are not like the product of any kind of intentional process and lead to negative outcomes. That's to make it like super quickly. Yeah.
So basically, because there's still certain competition outcomes, it's going to still have some of the same negative outcomes that would normally happen.
Yes.
And even under a socialist mode, would state with a democratic control, like a co-op control of the corporation, and with state incentives. So one of the things that you're basically rejecting is the idea that markets are particularly good information sorters.
At least when you put that point in general.
Right.
Like maybe there might be like I tend to have this I tend to have this very agnostic which might make sounds like a little bit of okay, hey, I'm just like, yeah, I don't say anything about this to not say anything wrong, but more of a little bit of an agnostic approach in terms of like, okay, let's kind of see what works, but I don't really like. I think having at least like the minimal position of like, okay, at least on like a macro scale, on like a like really this like macroeconomic coordination scale, markets like just it's not the way. Like that's not yeah, and maybe in like very constrained circumstances, they might have certain advantages, and then it's kind of like okay, let's find that out. Like that's my minimal position, I would say here. Yeah.
So one thing I would maybe add to that a little bit is the kinds of problems that markets seem to solve for. We now have developed other technologies that can solve for them. That would have been much harder in the 19th century. I mean, absolutely.
Probably.
I mean, before cybernetic databases and all that, it's very hard to account for multiple inputs and different preferences. One thing that it leads me to think a lot about is that in the aughts there was a bunch of American libertarians who were talking about like, well, one of the things about capitalism is you get a diversity of products that meet different aesthetic needs, and you have choice in that, and you have a large range of choices in that. And there have been time periods where that's been true. I don't want to say it's always false, but there are time periods like right now where that is not true. Like choice constraints actually highly constrained right now.
It's also, yeah, super
Go ahead.
quickly. I think it's also not like a point that you should say, okay, hey, that's like that's what you might say, like in itself desirable, that like, or that it's even like widely desirable by like lots and lots of people. Like sometimes it's also like, okay, you have like so much choice, like I don't know, everyone who has ever like shopped for like specific technical stuff, like for a PC or like for a phone or something, and you have like tech reviews online exist for a purpose. And like basically you have you have to do so much work to also figure out what are the minute differences between these different products. And that's work and time that you put in there. And it's kind of like a little bit of a surprise game in the end of of if the thing is gonna hold its promise or not. And
Which is why a lot of people use brand sorting without doing that research, right? Even though that's not really a rational thing to do, but
yeah,
it's a time saver.
True. Yes. And also, like, for example, there's an interesting little corporation here in Germany, or at least where I'm around, which is called Picnic, which is kind of like it's nothing new. It's kind of like, okay, oh, you have an app, you like go through your app and select your groceries that you want to have, and then they deliver these groceries to your door. But the thing is, like, they have like a very like a very shrunken down inventory of stuff that you can choose from. So like not much choice. And I think they also like they source their stuff basically from other big grocery stores. And it's basically, okay, hey, you and it's really successful. Like basically because you don't have kind of like this overload of choice, and because it's just these like essentials like groceries, where it's like, okay, hey, you know, I kind of know what I want, and who the fuck cares if I have like the choice between like, I don't know, 5 different types of paprika or two. Like, that's fine. And so yeah, maybe now you can go on with the story that you started, but I just want to interject where it's like, okay, hey, even today you can kind of like see, hey, you know, sometimes having less choice in a world that's like so kind of like information overload, and like, oh, you have to make little choices here and there. Sometimes not having to choose what kind of grocery you buy at that moment is fine. Is actually a relief. And maybe in certain services we see that people actually crave for that, and they even pay sometimes more money in order not have to choose.
Well, I'm thinking about the two European style grocery stores we have in America, which is Audi and Trader Joe's. They're both actually Audi. They're different Audis.
I heard about American Ollie, and it's what I've heard of it is that it's a different beast. That
it's a totally different beast to what it is in Germany.
I used to work at Aldi here.
Oh.
Yeah. I put like, now I work at Rewe as a cashier, another grocery store chain. But I put like in the early morning before the store actually opened. We sorted through like the vegetables and the fruits and like what was still good, and put new stuff in. And yeah, I had like half a year of permanent sleep deprivation because of that. Yeah.
but what is interesting is what a lot of people like about those two stores is relatively little choice, decent quality selection, and they just go there and buy what they need. And as opposed to, say, Walmart, where I can tell you, when I lived abroad I mean, and I lived in capitalist countries for the most part. When I lived abroad for almost a decade, when I came back to American Walmart, I nearly had a panic attack. I was just like, why are there 3 aisles of shampoo? Um, like,
But this is, oh my god, this is so no. Like, oh my god, I've worked way too much time of my life in grocery stores.
mhm,
Now that I'm realizing. Like I did gig work for like a whole year, like but not like delivery gig work, but
mhm.
basically like an app where you had like different jobs for each day, and it's kind of like, oh, today you work at a grocery store filling in the shelves, the next day you work at like a clothing store folding clothes. Other, like, I also worked in like a logistics factory, which was fucking hell, like a logistical facility, kind of like somewhat Amazon style. Um, but yeah, what I realized in grocery stores, like, is especially in the big ones, you have this aesthetics of abundance. Like you're never allowed to kind of like let the customer see, oh, there are only like this and that like many bags of chips left. It always needs to look, of course, there's always a limited amount of chips on the shelves, but it always needs to look as if it doesn't make any matter, like if you take one of them, or like it always has to like overflow almost, and like this aesthetic, like really how that was like in how to say that, like created this aesthetics of abundance, how like you stuff as much stuff in there as possible, um was like super and I've never been to an American supermarket. uh I really want to. I've never been to the US. I really want to go to the Walmart.
It's a weird dystopian place. I have a love-hate relationship with the French theorist Baudrillard, but Baudrillard's description of America actually is somewhat apt. Like, um, so I was thinking about this, and choice paralysis and aesthetics, and yet, if you're having a democratic, if you're having democratic inputs, then to go back to where we started, what is the function of aesthetics to get people to engage in a democratic form of economic planning?
I think that probably also has like multiple aspects to it again.
Mm-hmm.
I'm gonna start with the, let's say, like the instrumental propagandistic one, because like that's the easiest one. Um, in terms of like simply, I think what really bugged me about the way, like the aesthetics that have been circulating in the discourse so far around democratic economic planning, like that we talked about earlier, was this: they were so charged with associations of people that were super off-putting.
Mm-hmm.
Like I basically asked, like, to say it a little bit cringe, but I basically think, okay, you have to operate on a vibes basis, which basically means like, okay, what are the associations that come into your head when you see something? And so the aesthetics need to like respond to and embody like and speak to like the hopes, fears, and dreams of people. Like, um, this now sounds like super simple, but kind of like, okay, hey, it needs to conjure up like a vision of, okay, this is kind of like a life, like living in such a society, living in like such an economic system might be something closer to the good life than what I have now. Like, hey, okay, this might not end up in, like, it should also address, for example, the fears of dystopia. I think you should not kind of like, because like the idea of a planned economy is just like so drenched in these associations with dystopia, with totalitarianism, yada yada. It should address that. That's important, I think. But it should not it should not purely be on the defensive and address these, but also of like, okay, hey, look, there can be these associations of like, hey, of there can be hope. There can be like, hey, what if you could have democratic input into the economy? Be that on like a small scale in terms of like what you're consuming, be that on your own work at your own workplace, which is probably like one of the biggest parts for people, or be that for like macroeconomic investment types decisions with regards to like energy transition and that type of stuff, or like, hey, what kind of like transportation do you want to have? And so kind of like the aesthetics have to play that role of, to say it stupidly, sell people that idea, to like really communicate, hey, this is what would be possible. This is how your life could look like then in this case. And I think that's like the number one aspect. And then you might say, okay, given we had some form of like democratic economic planning, that would we would live in such a society and such an economy, and what role would aesthetics play to get people engaged in the planning process? I think there stuff like really stuff like interface design and like data visualization, which now sound very like design techie kind of way, but I think that will just play a big role, because it's like, okay, to kind of like communicate planning data, for example, in your own corporation that you're working at, and like, hey, what's your own planning data? What's the planning data of your sector, for example, uh, like your economic sector, and to be able to make decisions there. And for that type of stuff, you need like data visualizations, you need good interface design, and that sounds very boring. That sounds very like not exciting, nothing really artsy kind of stuff. But I think that or this also doesn't mean, oh, we can like interface design our way out of capitalism. Like, I'm not saying that. I just say stuff like interface design and data visualization should not be outright rejected or put off as like, oh no, this is not important. Like,
No, I think anyone who works in technical communication or informatics knows that you have to do those things. Like capitalists know you have to do those things, and so the idea that we don't think about that as something out of capitalist society to utilize to help people plan is a little weird. I mean, it's just
yeah. Think about it in terms of like, okay, interface design kind of determines how you as an individual, or like maybe like a group of people in your team, in your corporation or something, how you interact with a system much, much larger, much more complex than you, and that you would otherwise probably not really that you will never completely understand, but otherwise almost not at all understand. And interface design is kind of like, okay, how do you translate this into something that's like cognizable to you? And that's like, oh, given this knowledge that this thing gives me now, this interface, I can now make decisions. And also through that, intentionally influence the system that's like much larger and more complex than me. And like that's like on like the most abstract scale, I think that's what interface design is kind of about. And yeah, that's important.
yeah, would agree.
Yeah. Yeah.
All right, well, um, I think people should check out your exhibit. It will be in the show notes on this channel, and for those of you listening, it will probably be in the show notes on the podcast too. Um, I would like you to plug anything you want to plug, Eric.
Yeah. Let me think. Yeah, maybe we can also put like my link tree in the show notes, which is just kind of like, okay,
We can do that.
my socials will be in there, like recent, either like articles, podcast appearances, etc. Like, yeah, and also everyone, like, if you think anything I talked about here is even remotely interesting, and you want to like get in touch with me about that, or like about in depth, like feel free to like get in touch with me through social media, whatever. I'm happy about that. Yeah. And also,
Okay.
thanks very much for having me on. And yeah,
Thanks for
thanks a
coming
lot.
on. I'm actually very interested in the overlap between aesthetics and socialism, other than another podcast about how socialist realism is actually better than I think it is. And I mean, look, I like the good 30s era poster, but there's a limit to that. Anyway,
I have a certain poster of a certain not Soviet figure, but like another communist figure right behind the monitor, right? It's like half ironically, because like the aesthetics of propaganda are also like very interesting and like meshed into like like modern day collages of things. They're also interesting, and it's the perfect thing is like from Amazon, and it's like these super cheap Amazon printouts, and it even has like the file name printed onto the thing. Like it's like so.
Wow. That's funny. And we'll leave on that little bit of commentary.
Okay.